My name is Yael Soren, and I used to believe that words could fix anything. I spent 19 years as a diplomatic attaché for the Human Galactic Liaison Office, which is a fancy title for someone who sits in uncomfortable chairs across from alien dignitaries and smiles until their face hurts. I negotiated trade agreements, settled border disputes, and once talked a Veth fleet commander out of firing on a human survey vessel by spending 6 hours explaining the concept of an honest mistake. I was good at my job. I believed in patience. I believed in process. I believed that the galaxy, for all its strangeness, was full of beings who, deep down, wanted the same basic things: safety, prosperity, and to be left alone to live their lives. I stopped believing that on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of a conclave session when every communication channel in the chamber lit up at once. That never happens. The conclave chambers are shielded, secured, and signal dampened to the point where you could be standing in them while a star went supernova and you would finish your meeting first. But the signal that came through that morning punched through every layer of protection like it was made of paper, because someone had designed it to do exactly that. Someone wanted every species in that room to hear it at the same time. It was a distress beacon, colony vessel registry. Human. The ship was called the Meridian. She was a mid-class colony transport carrying 431 passengers on a standard migration route to a settlement world in the outer territories. The passenger manifest included 309 children. They were part of a school migration program, which meant they were between the ages of 6 and 14, traveling with chaperones and teachers, most of them seeing space for the first time in their lives. The program had been running for 11 years without incident. Parents trusted it. The children took pictures of stars through the porthole windows and sent them home. The Veth Dominion destroyed the Meridian at 0614 standard hours, citing the vessel's route as an unauthorized transit through what they called reclaimed territory. The destruction was complete. There were no survivors. I know this because I read the report. I read it 3 times, sitting very still in my chair, while the conclave chamber filled with noise around me. Representatives from 40 species were talking at once, some in outrage, some in confusion, some in the careful, measured tones of beings who were already calculating what this meant for their own political positions. I heard none of it. I was reading the manifest. My daughter's name was Petra. She was 8 years old. She had been accepted into the school migration program 6 months earlier and had talked about nothing else since. She wanted to be a xenobiologist. She had a particular interest in alien soil ecosystems, which is a very specific passion for an 8-year-old. But Petra was a very specific kind of child. She had sent me a drawing 2 weeks before departure, a planet with rings, labeled in her careful handwriting, Mom's Work Planet. She thought it looked like the images I sent her from the conclave station. I sat with the manifest in my hands until the Veth ambassador took the floor. He was a tall being, segmented, with the particular stillness that Veth carry when they are comfortable and powerful. He expressed regret for the incident in the way that someone expresses regret for a minor scheduling conflict. He used the phrase, reclamation of contested space. He noted that the human population, as a species, maintained a high reproductive rate. He said the loss was, and I remember this exactly, statistically negligible. The conclave murmured. There were calls for an emergency session. A Thavari elder proposed a formal inquiry. The Kessin delegation requested a procedural recess. Everything moved the way institutions always move, when they want to look like they are doing something without actually doing anything at all. I closed the manifest. I straightened my jacket. I walked out of the chamber in a perfectly straight line, and I sat down on a bench in the corridor outside, and I thought for a very long time. I want to be honest about what happened in my mind during those hours, because people have since described what I did as instinctive, or emotional, or the act of a grieving mother who lost control. That is not accurate. What happened was the opposite of losing control. I had spent 19 years learning how the galaxy worked. I had spent 19 years watching which species had power and why, which systems were fragile and where, which relationships looked strong from the outside and were hollow underneath. I had been polite and patient and useful for 19 years, and in that time, I had learned things that no warship or weapon could have taught me. I did not grieve first. I made a list. I sent one message to the Seoul Defense Council, not a request for military action, just a file transfer. The file was labeled Project Good Neighbor, which is a name I chose because it made me feel better about what was inside it. The file contained a complete structural analysis of the Veth Dominion's dependencies, every supply chain, every critical system, every point of failure, every relationship they had with human contractors, human navigators, human medical suppliers, and human agricultural engineers. It also contained 3 separate projected timetables for different levels of response, modeled down to the month. The council reviewed it in 11 minutes. Then they sent back 2 words. Your call. I gave the call. What happened over the next 24 hours was not a battle. There were no ships exchanged, no weapons fired, no declarations of war. Human vessels simply stopped being where they had been. 17 ships vanished from galactic tracking systems simultaneously, which caused a minor panic among long-range monitoring stations before everyone decided it must be a sensor glitch. It was not a sensor glitch. 3 Veth fuel processing stations experienced technical failures within the same 6-hour window. The failures were precise, contained, and caused no casualties, because causing casualties was never the point. The point was that human engineering teams had been contracted to maintain those stations for 6 years and knew their systems better than the Veth engineers who had built them. We knew where every fault line was because we had been the ones filling them in. The pharmaceutical consortium that supplied approximately 40% of Veth medical compounds announced an internal supply chain audit effective immediately. The audit would take an indeterminate amount of time. The consortium was headquartered on a human station. Human navigators, who piloted a significant portion of all faster-than-light vessels operating in Veth space, under agreements that predated the current government by decades, filed simultaneous leave requests citing personal and family emergencies. This was, technically, the Veth jump lanes, which required navigation expertise that took years to develop, and that the Veth had largely outsourced because it was cheaper than training their own people, went quiet. 2 Veth border worlds that relied on human-designed agricultural biotechnology reported unexpected crop failures. The soil microorganisms, engineered by human bioscience teams under long-term contracts, required ongoing adjustment and calibration from the teams that designed them. The teams were no longer available. The Veth High Council sent a furious transmission, demanding an explanation. I replied personally. My message contained 1 sentence. It was the exact sentence their ambassador had used in the conclave chamber, quoted back to them, word for word, with correct punctuation. I received no response. By the 36th hour, 3 other galactic powers had contacted the conclave in a state of what I can only describe as controlled alarm. They had begun quietly auditing their own dependencies and found the same thing the Veth were finding, which is that human infrastructure had become so deeply woven into the normal operation of their civilizations that it was functionally invisible. Not because we had hidden it, because no one had thought to look. We were the people who kept things running. We were the ones you called when the system needed maintaining, or the medicine needed compounding, or the route needed charting. We had been useful for so long that useful had become the same thing as invisible, and invisible had become the same thing as harmless. An elder Thavari diplomat, one of the most respected voices in the conclave, found me in the corridor outside the emergency session and spoke to me quietly. She said that her people had always considered humans the gentle species, the ones who talked instead of fought. The ones who built small ships and asked polite questions, and never seemed particularly threatening. I told her that was exactly right. I told her we had never needed to be threatening, because you had all invited us in and paid us to be helpful, and we had been very, very helpful, and the entire time, we had been paying attention. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, very carefully, that she hoped we would be reasonable. I told her I was being extremely reasonable. Unreasonable would have been a fleet. This was accounting. At the 48th hour, I went to my quarters. I have a small cabin on the conclave station, assigned to me as part of the diplomatic housing program. Petra had visited me there once, 3 years ago, when I brought her to the station during a school holiday, so she could see where I worked. She had pressed her face against the porthole window for 2 hours, watching cargo vessels drift past and asking me questions I did not always know how to answer. Before she left, she drew me a picture, a planet with rings, because she had seen one through the window and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I sat with that drawing for 4 minutes. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket and went back to work. By the 66th hour, the Veth High Council arrived at the conclave station in full. Not a delegation, not a representative body. The entire ruling council, traveling together, which had not happened outside their home system in living memory. They did not announce themselves with ceremony. They came quietly, which told me more than anything they could have said. They met with me in a small conference room, not the main chamber. There were 9 of them and 1 of me. They offered reparations. They offered territorial concessions along the outer boundary lines. They offered to hand over the specific military commanders who had authorized the strike on the meridian for whatever legal proceedings humanity wished to pursue. They used the word mercy many times. I counted 17. I listened to everything they said without interrupting, because I was raised to be polite, and old habits do not disappear just because your heart has been broken. Then I told them what I wanted. I did not want their territory. I did not want money, or commanders to put on trial, or any of the things that species offer when they are trying to calculate the minimum cost of making a problem go away. I told them I wanted something that would last longer than any of us in that room. I wanted a universal accord, binding across all conclave members, making the deliberate targeting of civilian vessels a species-level war crime, not enforced by a conclave vote, which can be delayed and debated and quietly buried in committee. Enforced automatically, structurally, by the withdrawal of human infrastructure services from any government that violated it. Every species would sign. The penalty for refusal to sign would be immediate and total. The Veth signed first. I stood before the full conclave 3 hours later. I was the only human in the room. I spoke for 11 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not appeal to sympathy or describe what had been lost, because I was not there to make anyone feel bad. I was there to change something permanent. When I finished, the vote was unanimous. It had never been unanimous before on anything. Afterward, one of the younger conclave representatives, a curious and earnest being from a species I had always liked, approached me with a question. He asked whether this had been the plan all along, whether humans had deliberately embedded themselves so deeply into galactic infrastructure as a long-term strategy, whether the helpfulness had always been a kind of preparation. I thought about the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. I told him no. The plan had simply been to be useful. Humans are good at finding problems and fixing them, and the galaxy had a great many problems that needed fixing, and we had needed the work. There was no grand design. There was just 19 years of showing up and doing the job and paying attention. He turned us into leverage when he forgot we were people. His ambassador did it in 11 words, on a Tuesday, in front of 40 species. I walked out of the conclave chamber into the long corridor that runs along the outer ring of the station. There are windows there, floor to ceiling, looking out into open space. I stood at one of those windows, and I looked at the stars for a long time. Somewhere out there, in a debris field that would not be recovered because there was nothing left to recover, was a ship called the Meridian. Somewhere in that field was my daughter, who had wanted to be a xenobiologist, who had pressed her face against a porthole window and fallen in love with a ringed planet she saw for 30 seconds. I sat down on the floor of that corridor, right there in the middle of the station, with people walking past, and I cried for the first time since Tuesday. Not because we had won. Winning is not the word for what had happened, and it did not feel like any kind of victory. I cried because it was over, and she was still gone, and nothing that had happened in the last 72 hours changed that simple and total fact. But 431 names now meant something. They meant a law that would outlast every person in that building. They meant that the next ship, and the one after that, and all the ones after that, would carry their passengers to their destinations. I reached into my jacket pocket, and I held the drawing she had made me. A planet with rings. Mom's work planet. I stayed there until I was ready to stand up again. Then I stood up, and I went back to work.